You fool! Warren is dead. Welcome to HorrorBabble. From the Library of Rillier concludes today with a brand new Mythos story courtesy of British writer Paul Draper. In A Church Within a Church, a mysterious walled-in area is uncovered by a renovation team restoring a dilapidated church. Be sure to visit Paul's website, linked below. Series artwork by the great Vishnu Prasad. We hope you enjoyed this one, folks, and as always, we hope you've enjoyed the series. And without further ado, A Church Within a Church by Paul Draper. How in my weakness can my hopes depend on one lone God, though mighty be his power? Why can Jove's host no more assistance lend, to soothe my pain and cheer my troubled hour? To the Old Pagan Religion by H.P. Lovecraft. 1. A Grey Morning. I need to think. It was a grey morning. We pulled into All Saints' Church at Anchester just after dawn. I recall this particular renovation wasn't straightforward, but my memories have been hazy since we finished, so I'll just think it through and the details should become clear. There was a low haze, the sun barely breaching the banks of mist. I remember parking the van and having to stretch out my right shoulder after the drive. For some reason it had been irritating me. Perhaps I had slept awkwardly. I was with the full Hughes Renovators team, as I recall. Myself, Gordon Hughes, and my big son Jack, wearing his signature parka coat, of course, and our wiry veteran all-rounder Derek Castle in his old overalls. Derek is the most experienced in listed building work. He comes from a local line of builders and restorers. His grandfather worked on the ill-fated Exham Priory restoration nearly 100 years ago, which was struck by disaster when the client, a Mr. Delaporte, went insane and murdered an associate during the work. We were the initial team. Once the first couple of days' preparatory work was completed, my wider local group would arrive to help get through the bulk of it. I was happy to be carrying out this new project so close to my home. Being able to see Alice at the end of working days was always the best arrangement. It's easy to become strangers in a marriage when you're away for long contracts. All Saints' Church was an atmospheric sight from the get-go. A rotting notice board, long pair of announcements, stood by an ornately carved, probably 15th century lich gate that led from the parking area through to the churchyard, where headstones of varying ages leaned back and forth amongst the overgrown grass. An old yew tree, common in so many English churchyards, spread its branches out majestically above the graves. As arranged, the lady from the church's National Council waited by the studded oak door at the porch. Hannah? Yes, that was her name. She was to be present through the work as the client contact and to provide opinions on any issues we revealed. It was good to finally meet her. She was unassuming, but I do remember she had intense green eyes that thoroughly scanned us as she bade us welcome. Pleasantries out of the way, we stepped through the door with our tools and entered the church. 2. The First Church. The route to the contract had ultimately been quite simple once we had got past the labyrinthine complications placed in the way of it by the Church of England. I'd been on the odd local job for farming and haulage buildings the previous year. Quite simple work, easily handled between Derek and I, which was just as well with Jack frequently away with his diving and climbing. I'd almost forgotten we had written to the county council, inquiring about the All Saints renovation a couple of years prior as part of a general outreach regarding any likely work so close to our doorstep. It turned out that planning application for a complete renovation had been submitted to the diocese several years ago, and been bogged down in first the approval process and then finance issues at Anchester's Parochial Church Council, or PCC as it's known. The PCC was governed by measures from the Church of England, and its wheels turned so slowly, the second coming seemed more likely to occur first. When Jack returned from his scuba trip to America, he seemed intent on focusing on work. Perhaps that was enough adventure for 1 year, even for him. He was particularly interested in working on the All Saints job. Public discontentment was gaining pace, with a pressure group called the Friends of All Saints frequenting local newspapers. The lobby group claimed they had grant applications in flight and could work to raise money to restore the church. I must say I was so proud to learn that Jack had handled liaising with our architect network and pushed for faculty approval of the subsequent plans all by his own initiative, only bringing it to me once it looked like a genuine prospect. All Saints was a typical Grade 1 listed place of worship in the county, albeit a neglected one. Raised in the 14th century in the Perpendicular Gothic style, its primary material was flint, which at some point was rendered in a vaguely uncomely concrete. At the west end, a castellated tower with a solitary 18th century bell was propped by diagonal buttresses, giving it a classic English rural look. The congregation had dwindled over the decades, as with many across England, but the proposal in the renovation was to refresh the place and return it to a thriving community centre. The aim would be to not only revive worship, but provide an additional income as a venue for civic meetings and shows. As we stood in the atrium by the door, it was easy to see the grandeur that this building projected in the local community through the ages. Under the vaulted ceiling, the interior sported some unique stone canopies dating from that period, nestling under which were tombs of various regional nobles. A particularly striking one against the north wall was clearly an Easter sepulchre, a switch of service point for that holy time of year. The atrium still sported its original 14th century font, which was to be covered and then cleaned by a separate team once we'd finished the heavy work. The stained glass was accomplished 19th century artisanship, according to the church's plans. One glaring difference was a rather tasteless millennium window by the north aisle, installed just before the church fell into disuse. The difference in craftsmanship with the older work was sadly obvious. Other features dotted around the interior were a large doom painting showing the Last Judgment, assorted memorial stonework and carvings, 2 gaudy aristocratic hatchments, and a World War I memorial dedicated to, against national trend, only 3 sons of the village who died in those tragic years in Europe. The renovation plans were quite ambitious, and the potential revenue for us was vital, as moths were making homes in our coffers. There was to be an entire rewiring of the church, a new array of chandelier-mounted infrared heaters, a new toilet section and kitchen, and an upgraded sound system. Once the main structural work had been completed, there would be a complete restoration of the pipe organ, which was to be repositioned on a new mezzanine floor, restored from the existing original 19th century gallery. As far as the exterior went, the concrete rendering that unsubtly hid the original masonry was to be surveyed, and where necessary, mortar joints would be repointed or carefully cleaned. I chatted to Derek about the approach as we stood in the center of the nave, staring up at the dark rafters. Derek is a gentleman, quite spiritual in his own way, and would often start jobs by feeling the ambience in a location. He seemed quite struck by All Saints, as I remember. He mentioned I ought to keep a little eye on Jack, who had been largely silent on his return to work. Perhaps he was growing up and just wanted to get his head down and focus on his trade for a while. He seemed okay to me, hefting equipment about and connecting a kerosene generator as we prepared to get started. Hannah set herself up on a table in a corner of the nave, bringing a folder of plans out of her briefcase, as well as a selection of ancient-looking books, probably pertaining to church history, in case we needed to refer to anything. As always, basic setup was the priority on day one. We brought some tools through and erected a safety fence on the site to block any curious passers-by. The area was now a hard hat zone, and work began that afternoon on removing some of the trim and paneling. 3. Renovation Begins. The way the work proceeded is becoming clearer to me now, although I still can't remember if we managed to finish or not. It'll come, I'm sure. I do recall that we clicked through the schedule fairly normally. As with many of these old buildings, there were an assortment of additions and adjustments in the interior, some of which had to be pulled out in order to complete the structural basics needed that form the basis of the renovation. There was a minor wall in the north transept, or a short arm of the cross, if you look down on a two-dimensional church floor plan that came away easily, and revealed a selection of old chairs and basic wooden musical instruments. These were probably used for Sunday school at some point last century. Derek made a find of greater interest behind the altar, where he noticed markedly different pointing coming away from the exterior wall spanning the width of the apse. Jack came over and expressed particular eagerness to explore that wall, saying that it didn't quite marry up with the exterior dimensions, so had to contain further space. Although about 10 feet in height, we noted it wasn't load-bearing, and to confirm this I stood on a tall ladder in the nave and could see that a flat, wooden, quasi-mezzanine section bridged the space between that wall and the far eastern end of the church. There appeared to be no access to this upper level, and nothing was stored on it. Hannah checked over the plans and stated that despite that section not being in the work's scope, she was keen to have it assessed. I puffed my cheeks a little at the extra effort this would take, particularly if it was decided to knock the whole thing through. But as the budget could encompass some wriggle room, decided it would be worth it. Jack and Derek did knock tests and ran magnets and a cable detector across the wall's face. It certainly wasn't plasterboard, but neither was it a typical stud wall, being apparently solid brick across the entire breadth and height. It was built to stand. As the day grew dim, we turned on some LED floodlights and fired up a couple of kerosene heaters to ward off the November chill. Breaking the back of initial prep on day one was a big win, so I was eager to get through as much as possible. We left Hannah poring over some of her books as the first day came to a close. She seemed intense and distracted, but looked up long enough to say good night. 4. The second church. I recall nothing of that evening. It's a blank. The next thing I remember is arriving the following day. Again, a sore right shoulder. Perhaps I'm getting a bit old for this kind of work. Nothing paracetamol wouldn't fix. We found Hannah already inside the church, in the same position we'd left her in. She looked tired, and if it wasn't so ludicrous, I'd have thought she'd stayed looking at her books and notes all night. She said that she'd been on her phone to the diocese and had gained permission to knock through the wall behind the altar. This adjusted our schedule somewhat, but if we were going to do it, it was best that we started on that straight after lunch, after completing some partly finished tasks from the previous day. Derek and Jack laid out some dust covers and started with small hammers and a pry bar. I recall Hannah pulling me to one side as the sound of metal on stone echoed around the old building. She had concerns about what was behind the wall, with the possibility of architecturally interesting features or valuable artifacts being discovered. We determined that an initial exploratory hole just large enough to look through would be the way to go. After 2 hours' careful removal of a portion of the brickwork, I could shine a torch through. Motes of brick dust swirled in the beam, as a space about 10 feet deep and apparently spanning the width of the apse was revealed. There was no other light source. This cavity had been in darkness for decades. From what I could see, it was bare of any contents, although there appeared to be a wooden square on the floor. After one more hour's careful dismantling of a wider section, enlarging the hole, I, Derek, and Hannah were able to don ventilator masks and climb through into the space. Jack stayed outside for safety backup, in case we came across any issues blocking our egress. Inside, the torches swept the space, as musty air reached our lungs through the filters. We could now see all of this unusual room. At the north side, to our left after entering, there was a small pile of bric-a-brac stacked. A couple of paintings, some hassocks, and a rotten box containing spoiled vestry garments and other altar linens. Perhaps this had once been a sacristy area, where priests prepared themselves for service. Our attention turned to the wooden floor section, which was topped with an iron ring. On closer inspection, it was clearly a trapdoor. A bit of firm but careful work with a pry bar released the opening up on its hinge, which complained with the stiffness of many years as it rose and swung over onto the opposite side of the joint. Stone steps led down into the darkness. Something awful was here, I think. Something down there. Damn, it's still so hazy, but this is horrendously triggering somehow. I can feel my hesitation, and am acutely aware of my aching shoulder. I don't really want to think about this anymore. I have to. If I don't, I'm just stuck in the dark here. Wherever here is. Hannah was eager to descend the steps. She was the client and had the right gear on, so I said I would go down to check the space with her. Derek stayed up in the room to sort through the objects and measure the space. I went first, my bright torch picking out the downward flagstones as stale air rose from below. The descent was a sequence of about 12 steps. At the bottom, a short corridor with a rounded ceiling turned right, heading under the altar overhead and ending after a few yards at a door. There were 3 iron brackets in the walls on either side of the passageway, perhaps sconces for torches or fixtures for lanterns at some point. The old wooden door was arched but fairly basic, lightly studded with a black iron handle and plated keyhole. A knock revealed it was of some thickness, the surface dry to the touch and apparently free of any groundwater dampness. I tried the handle, but the lock stood fast. I turned to Hannah and was about to suggest we return above ground to contact a locksmith and her superiors, but at this point she moved past me and produced a large old key I hadn't noticed. It slid into the lock and turned. I didn't shine the torch directly into her face, but swung the beam close enough to see her expression. It was of nervous excitement. She had expected this. The door swung inwards, and into what I could only describe as a small chapel. There were no obvious trappings of Christianity here, but at the end of the small room, only 20 feet squared, was undoubtedly an altar, rudimentary but scored with parallel lines in a style of etching I had never seen before. Atop it was a small ceramic or porcelain figurine of a many-legged animal, perhaps a sheep or goat, with what appeared to be a marble base. It was clear we had not been told the complete story, but even so I was speechless as she walked forward and lowered to her knees in front of it. "The Magna Mater," she said, before continuing murmuring in a language I did not know. She then reached out and pushed a few sections of the altar in sequence, with a small drawer emerging at the end of the last press. Reaching inside, she withdrew a silvery metal tube, possibly made of aluminium is the closest I can guess. She unstoppered one end of it and withdrew a scroll, shining her torch on it. It was written in a faded grey script on a bluish parchment. At that point, We heard a loud bang, originating from upstairs but echoing down the corridor outside. Then a short, awful scream. Hannah froze and looked up, wild-eyed and terror-stricken. I ran to the door to see a flaming, flailing figure totter, thrashing down the steps at the end. I shone the flashlight at him. Advancing towards our door, he was a blazing torch from the waist up, and as the beam lowered down, I recognized Derek's work overalls and boots. I tried to move closer, but the heat was too intense. He slumped to his knees without making a sound as smoke billowed up into the headspace, before collapsing face first, writhing to the flagstones. I recoiled in horror back into the small chapel. From above, a low howl sounded. I started to go into the corridor and past the smouldering body, but Hannah grabbed my arm and hissed for me to stay still. 5. Trapped. I demanded that Hannah tell me what was going on. Clearly she had known, or at least suspected, that we would find this place. What was it? What was the object she now held? And what the hell was that noise above in the church? She implored me to keep quiet, and moved to close the door to, but not entirely shut, enough to see along the corridor to the steps. I can recall what she then told me. "This place has been sealed for nearly 100 years, she said, eyes fixed on the door. "Yes, I'm employed by the church, but I'm also in an older order. We used to be centered around the old Exham Priory site, which before that was a shrine to Cybele and the Magna Mater." She pointed her torch at the figure on the altar. "The All-Mother with 1,000 young. This," she held up the tube with the scroll, "was created by my order eons ago, almost at the start of humankind. We had hoped it still existed, that it had been brought here. All the clues pointed to this site. It's why we blocked so many attempts to work on All Saints until I was ready, with the key we knew was somewhere in the old Priory caves." "This is completely crazy," I hissed furiously. "Why on earth weren't we told about this?" Among my books upstairs, I have an incomplete copy of what we call the Black Book, written by a man called von Janst, a German, over 150 years ago. It tells of scrolls created by priests of the Magna Mater. This may look like a piece of paper, but in fact it's probably the most important weapon we could have against a great evil that has been dormant for hundreds of thousands of years, but may awake at any time. I know how this sounds, completely mad, but you have to trust me. Mad, yes. I sat down heavily. I don't know about any of this. I'm just here to do a job. There may be a fire upstairs, so we need to get out of here. The other work team won't be here until the morning. If this section or the main roof collapses, we could be buried or suffocated before they do. I can't hear my son. He's up there, and I need to know he's safe." "I need to think," she said. "That didn't sound human upstairs. It may be too late for your son already." She held up the tube. "Others will be looking for this." She turned and knelt before the altar, apparently in meditation or even attempted communion with whatever that thing was she was on her knees before. I could not wait for an answer to come from all this nonsense. I'm a practical man, and this was time to move. I opened the door to the sound of Hannah's protest and proceeded cautiously down the corridor. My torch beam swept across my dead friend as I passed, his body still smoldering. The stench of kerosene mixed with the putrid, tanned odor of charred skin and hair filled the space, making me gag. The trapdoor was still open, the darkness of the cavity above more solid, since the day must have turned to dusk. As I climbed and my head reached the level of the upper floor, I saw an LED light appeared to be on in the nave, which was otherwise silent. My fear for Jack grew. "I have to get this to my car," whispered Hannah behind me. "This is too important." I held back my anger about her apparent disregard for Derek's death. and finished ascending the steps. 6. Ghatanothoa. We both stood in the concealed space. The torch revealed 2 discarded kerosene cans strewn on the floor. "Be careful," said Hannah, low. "We don't know what's up here." Surely she meant, who? "Jack," I hissed. "I'm okay, Dad. Come out," called his calm, familiar voice. My relief was palpable. I clambered back out through the access hole and turned to help Hannah through. The single LED shone brightly up toward the ceiling. I could just make out Jack, behind the beam and off to the side, seated at a back pew near the main door. His parka hood was up and rolled forward into a tube, so I couldn't make out his face. "Are you okay?" I called. "Derek." "Yes, I'm fine. Derek had an accident. It was awful." Jack wasn't prone to great spikes of emotion, but even so, his voice was unusually flat for such a statement. "I don't think that's Jack," said Hannah. "Of course it is," replied Jack, who couldn't possibly have heard her from the distance he sat at. We looked at the church door, the only exit that was open to us, as the others were chained for security. Hannah edged down the aisle. Jack turned his hooded head to the side and tracked her as she walked, face pointed down towards her feet. As she drew level with him, about 10 feet from the exit, he slid in one fluid motion to stand by her and reached up, gripping her by the neck. Impossibly, he lifted her up, straight-armed, so that her feet dangled a foot off the ground. Her startled cry was muffled by the pressure on her throat. Still, his attention seemed fixed on the floor. "I'll take that, thank you." He reached out with his other hand and wrenched the metal tube from her grasp. With a flick of his wrist and a sickening click, he snapped her neck. He threw her to the ground by the door, where she sprawled lifeless, like a marionette with snipped strings. He turned and walked towards me. I can feel the terror I felt then again now. It was utterly paralyzing. He stood before me, broad-shouldered and swaying slightly, parka hood angled down, so still I had no view of his face. "I'm sorry, Jack's dad," he said, still in monotone. What are you? Where is my son?" "Your son's body is before you. Your son's soul, if you believe in such things, is at the bottom of the Narragansett Bay. We don't see many down in the dark there, but he conveniently visited us." His voice seemed to resonate, coming as much from inside my head as from his hooded face. I don't understand." "We have a device in those waters, placed by a helpful fellow a long time ago. It allows communication with our planet, like a relay. We were able to pass that signal back to one of your great seas, where I suppose you can say, where I sleep. This body is just an avatar capable of speaking your language. It's a dream to me, but it lays the ground for my approaching ascension, which will be soon. This," he raised the metal tube, "would not have been helpful." "Give me back my son," I cried. It was nearly a minute before he spoke again. "I'm sorry, that's not possible. I can no longer maintain his appearance, and will soon dispose of this body. You will be the first for many years to know my face. Now, gaze into a fraction of the aspect of Ghatanothoa. An endless living death is your reward. You will relive this time, in this place here, until the end of time itself." With that, he lifted his head, and I stared through the tunnel of his hood, where I glimpsed, I struggled to describe it, an eternal pit, an infinite abyss. Deep in there writhed tentacles and a score of squid-like eyes, a kind of plasticky, scaled, wrinkled morass, shifting and utterly evil. My heart hammered, and my back braced as a kind of stultifying paralysis gripped my limbs. It felt like a heart attack, even a whole-body attack. A petrifying lamination of terror blasting me through my spine with the shock of 1,000 suns, 1,000 earthquakes. And now, just that pressure on my right shoulder, an infernal, pressing pressure. God! God in heaven, where are you? 7. The hospital. Alice continued gripping Gordon's right shoulder as the sedative was administered. Gordon's low, terrible wailing subsided as Dr. Portman watched readings stabilize on his bedside machine. Midazolam mixed with fentanyl appears to solve some of the discomfort, he said as Alice released her pressure. I'm sorry. We're no closer to working out what this is. We have some experts coming across from the US next week. They're aware of some similar cases in Boston many years ago. Although no one is still alive who dealt with them, they have some records. He's so cold, said Alice, running her hand along his cheek, above which Gordon Hugh's eyes remained closed. He had been here for 3 weeks, and she felt like she was in an unending nightmare. You still have no idea about the skin condition or the cause? I'm sorry, we've just not seen it before. It's like a kind of petrified leather effect. Our theory, and advice taken from the people at Porton Down, is that it wasn't a human-made agent that caused this, or a virus. We can't see any traces of viral activity in the bloods we've taken, which was difficult given the condition of the epidermis. Perhaps it was a dormant airborne toxin that was behind that opened space in the church. We're so sorry to not have any more information. No news on your son? No, they've not found him yet. Alice's face was etched with worry. One thing, said Dr. Portman. We've noticed his mental activity seems to loop in 2-day cycles. The first 24 to 36 hours seem fairly calm, although we have evidence of what I can only call REM activity behind the eyelids before the screaming starts, interjected Alice. Dr. Portman maintained his smooth tone. Well, before he becomes agitated. It's like he's repeatedly dreaming something, although we can't tell what, of course. We'll get to the bottom of this, Mrs. Hughes. Some of the best specialists in Europe have become aware of this case, and there is a group video call next week. For now, he seems stable, but in a suspended state. The drip we've forced into his arm appears to be delivering the needed nutrients. For now, we'll keep him monitored and isolated in this room until we understand what to do. He stood and left, shaking his head again at the 2 detectives outside the room who were eager to discuss the corpses located when the additional work team arrived at the church. As with every other day, Alice stayed with Gordon until visiting hours ended. Then she drove home to a house way too empty, but at least far enough from neighbors not to disturb them with her tears. Back at the hospital, in a darkened private room, Gordon's eyes relaxed their wild thrashing behind their lids. They stayed fixed on something for an hour, then began roving gently again. 8. A grey morning. I need to think. It was a grey morning. We pulled into All Saints' Church at Anchester just after dawn. I recall this particular renovation wasn't straightforward, but my memories have been hazy since we finished, so I'll just think it through and the details should become clear. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,